He heard a scream coming from the women's restroom and went in to help, but one video turned him into a criminal in the eyes of the entire city. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The hum of the truck's engine was the only sound cutting through the quiet evening. David Cole gripped the steering wheel with one hand, his other hand resting near the gear shift as he glanced in the rearview mirror. His daughter, Emily, was curled up in the back seat, her head resting against the car seat, mouth slightly open in sleep. The soft rise and fall of her breathing gave him a fleeting sense of peace. It had been a long day, another shift that stretched past 10 hours, but that was nothing new. Life had become a rhythm of work, drive, cook, sleep, and repeat ever since his wife passed away 3 years ago. There had been no time to mourn the way others did. No sitting in a dark room, staring at the walls. No long conversations with friends about feelings. He had a little girl who depended on him for everything, and grief had to become a companion he carried quietly, not something that could be allowed to paralyze him. The gas gauge glowed just below a quarter tank, and David sighed, deciding to pull into the next station. It wasn't far now until home, but he had learned not to push his luck. Emily would probably wake up soon and want juice or something to eat, and the thought of arriving home with nothing in the fridge was just another reminder of how much he had to do alone. He spotted a lonely gas station up ahead, its fluorescent lights pooling on the pavement like a small island in the dark. The highway was nearly empty, and for a moment he felt that familiar sense of isolation that came from living most of his life behind a windshield. The tires crunched softly as he pulled in next to one of the pumps, put the truck in park, and shut off the engine. Emily stirred slightly but didn't wake, her arms hugging the stuffed rabbit she never let out of her sight. David stepped out, stretching his back, feeling the ache of hours of sitting. The evening air was heavy with the smell of gasoline and asphalt cooling under the night sky. The convenience store glowed warmly a few feet away, and he decided to head inside after filling the tank. He moved quickly, trying to get everything done, before Emily woke up and began asking to use the bathroom or whining about being hungry. Inside the store, the smell of stale coffee and floor cleaner hit him, mixed with the faint hum of refrigerators lining the walls. He grabbed a bottle of water for himself, a small carton of chocolate milk for Emily, and a few snacks. There was a weariness in his body, the kind that never really went away, but tonight felt heavier than usual. And then he heard it, a sound that froze him where he stood. At first it was faint, like something carried on the wind, but it came again, sharper this time. A scream. Not a playful squeal or a raised voice, but a sound torn out of someone's throat, raw and terrified. It came from the direction of the bathrooms at the side of the store. David set the items on the counter without paying and turned his head toward the sound. There was no one else in the store besides the clerk, who didn't seem to have heard or didn't care enough to react. For a moment he hesitated. He had Emily in the truck. He couldn't just run toward danger, but the scream came again, followed by what sounded like mocking laughter and a thud. His chest tightened, a rush of adrenaline drowning out the fatigue. He hurried out to the truck, opened the door just enough to check on Emily. She blinked up at him, sleepily confused. "Daddy?" she mumbled. "It's okay, baby," he said softly, brushing her hair back. "Stay here, okay? Keep the doors locked." He reached in and pressed the lock button on the driver's door until he heard the click of all 4 doors. "I'll be right back." Her small face still held the softness of sleep, but her brow furrowed in worry. He gave her what he hoped was a reassuring nod before closing the door. The night air seemed colder now as he strode toward the side of the building, his boots hitting the pavement harder than he intended. The sound from inside was clearer now. Voices jeering, a single voice crying, "Stop!" He pushed open the door to the women's restroom. The harsh fluorescent light revealed a narrow room with chipped white tile and the smell of bleach. Against the far wall was a young woman, maybe 25, cornered near the sinks. She had tears streaking her face, her hair pulled loose as if someone had grabbed it. Around her stood 3 people, all holding up their phones, their faces lit with cruel amusement. They were shouting things at her, words David barely processed but understood by the tone. Humiliation, anger, a kind of pack mentality that turned a confrontation into a performance. For a split second, David stood frozen, taking in the scene. Then something primal kicked in. He crossed the room in a few quick steps and shoved the nearest person back, the phone clattering to the tile floor. "Get out of the way," he barked, his voice booming in the small room. The group reacted instantly, shouting, some backing away, one stepping forward as if to block him. He ignored them, grabbed the crying woman by the arm, and pulled her toward the door. One of the aggressors lunged forward, shouting something unintelligible, and shoved David in the shoulder. He reacted before thinking, swinging his fist, connecting with the attacker's face with a dull crack. The person fell to the floor, clutching their cheek, swearing loudly. Another raised a phone to film, but David was already moving, pulling the woman with him. They burst out into the cooler night air, the woman gasping, trying to catch her breath. David looked over his shoulder, expecting the group to follow, but they stayed inside, shouting after him that he would pay for this. His heart was hammering, his palms slick with sweat. He guided the woman toward the truck, but she shook her head, still crying, muttering that she just needed to get away. She stumbled toward the edge of the parking lot, disappearing into the dark. David watched her go for a moment, torn between following her and returning to Emily. His first responsibility was to his daughter. He climbed back into the truck, still breathing hard. Emily's eyes were wide, but she didn't speak. David started the engine, his hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. He pulled out of the station and back onto the road, the bright lights of the gas station fading into the distance behind him. He told himself he had done the right thing. He had stopped something bad from happening. He had protected someone who needed help. But as the miles passed under the tires and the night grew quieter again, a cold unease settled in his stomach. He knew somehow that this was not over. The drive home that night felt longer than usual. Even with the highway nearly empty and the cool air rushing in through the crack in the window, David's chest stayed tight, as if the events at the gas station had wrapped themselves around him and refused to let go. Emily eventually fell back asleep, but her silence felt heavier than before. When they reached the small house at the edge of town, David carried her inside, set her gently on her bed, and stood for a moment watching her breathe. The house was quiet, too quiet, and he realized his own hands were still shaking. He washed his face in the bathroom sink, stared at his reflection under the dim light, and tried to tell himself that what had happened was over. But by morning, it wasn't. He woke early, made coffee, and went through the motions of getting Emily ready for school, packing her lunch, tying her shoes. Everything felt normal for a few precious minutes. It wasn't until he arrived at work and saw the looks on his coworkers' faces that he knew something had changed. People were whispering near the break room, a few glancing at him, then quickly turning away. He set down his lunchbox and was about to ask what was going on when one of the younger guys from shipping came up, phone in hand, face pale. "Man, have you seen this?" David frowned and took the phone. The screen showed a paused video on a social media app, the title above it written in bold, accusing words. He pressed play. His stomach dropped. The footage was shaky but clear enough. It showed him storming into the bathroom, then cut suddenly to the moment he punched the person who had shoved him. There was no footage of what happened before, no sound of the girl screaming, no images of her cornered against the wall. Just him, a large man, throwing a punch in a women's restroom. The video ended with the person on the floor shouting threats at him, then screaming that they'd been assaulted. The clip had thousands of views already. The comments section was a battlefield. Some people furious, demanding his arrest, others praising him without knowing the full story. But most of what he saw were accusations. Words like violent, bigot, dangerous, scrolled past in endless succession. David felt his chest grow cold. He handed the phone back without a word and walked toward the loading dock, trying to breathe. By lunch break, the video had been shared on multiple platforms. His boss called him into the office, expression grave. The conversation was short. The company had a reputation to protect, and while they weren't suspending him yet, they were monitoring the situation. That night, when he picked Emily up from school, he noticed two mothers standing near the entrance, talking in low voices. One of them gave him a look that sent a chill down his spine. Not curiosity, but judgment. By the next day, the police came. The knock on the door was loud, early enough that Emily was still in her pajamas. David's stomach twisted when he saw the officers on the porch. They were polite but formal, handing him a document that confirmed his worst fear. A complaint had been filed, and he was required to appear for questioning. Emily clung to his leg, asking what was happening, but he could only tell her to get ready for school. The questioning was worse than he expected. In the sterile room at the station, under the flat, fluorescent lights, they asked him why he had entered a women's restroom, whether he knew the people involved, why he had used force. David explained everything. The screams, the scene he walked in on, how he acted on instinct to get the girl out. The officer took notes but kept a neutral face, giving away nothing. When it was over, David drove home with the weight of the report sitting like a stone in his chest. He knew enough about these things to understand that, on paper, it might look bad. A man hitting someone in a bathroom, regardless of the circumstances. That night, he couldn't eat. Emily asked him if he was mad at her, and the question nearly broke him. He scooped her up into his arms and told her no, but the look on her face stayed with him long after she fell asleep. The following week was a blur of tension. Articles started to appear online, some quoting activists demanding that he be charged to send a message. Photos of him, taken from his social media accounts, were plastered on posts calling him dangerous. One headline called him a vigilante. Another suggested that he had targeted people because of who they were. David stopped reading after that, and then one evening there was a knock at his door. He opened it to find the young woman from the gas station standing on his porch. Her hair was brushed this time, but there was still a shadow of fear in her eyes. She introduced herself, her name was Claire, and said she had been trying to find him for days. "I wanted to say thank you," she said, voice steady but soft. "If you hadn't walked in, I don't know what they would have done. I tried to get away, but they kept blocking me. They were filming everything, laughing. It was humiliating." David stepped aside and let her in. She sat at the kitchen table while Emily colored quietly in the living room. And for the first time, David heard the whole story. Claire had posted something on her social media account that criticized a local activist group for harassing another woman online. In response, members of that group found her at the gas station and confronted her. "They said they wanted to teach me a lesson," Claire said, staring down at her hands. "When you came in, I thought maybe they'd stop, but they didn't. They just turned their cameras on you." Her words left David with a mixture of relief and dread. Someone finally understood. Someone could tell the truth. But would anyone believe her? "I'll testify," Claire said, meeting his eyes. "If they try to take you to court, I'll be there. People need to know what really happened." David nodded slowly. "I appreciate that. More than you know." After she left, he stood for a long time at the window, looking out at the quiet street. Somewhere deep inside, a flicker of hope lit up, small but real. He wasn't entirely alone, but as the days passed, the storm outside grew louder. Flyers were posted downtown with his name on them. Someone spray-painted "Justice for Victims" on the sidewalk near his driveway. And then the official letter came in the mail. He was being charged and would have to stand trial. When he told Emily, he tried to make it sound simple, like it was just something Daddy had to take care of. But that night, as he sat alone on the couch after she went to bed, the reality hit him full force. If things went badly, he could lose his job, his reputation, maybe even custody of the only person he had left. David buried his face in his hands and stayed like that for a long time. He had stepped in to protect someone. He had done what any decent person should do. And somehow the world had turned him into the villain. The notice of the trial date arrived 2 weeks later, tucked into the mailbox as if it were nothing more than a utility bill. David stood at the curb holding the envelope for a long moment before tearing it open, his pulse hammering in his ears. The date was set for next month, which gave him a few weeks to prepare. Though prepare for what, he wasn't sure. He had never been in court except for jury duty once, years ago. The thought of standing there being judged by strangers who might have already seen the video and formed their opinions made his stomach twist. Word spread quickly. It was as though the entire town knew within 24 hours. The next morning, when David stopped at the grocery store, he caught 2 men whispering near the deli counter, their voices low but sharp enough for him to catch phrases like, "bathroom guy," and "he's the one." He kept his head down and finished shopping, but by the time he left, he felt as though invisible hands were pointing at him from every corner. At work, the tension grew. Some co-workers still spoke to him as usual, but others kept their distance, as if simply being seen near him might make them guilty by association. By the end of the week, his boss called him into the office again and warned him that if the public pressure became too great, they might have to put him on unpaid leave until things blew over. Blew over, David thought bitterly as he drove home that night. As if this was a passing storm that would just fade on its own. It wasn't a storm. It was a slow, grinding machine, chewing at the edges of his life day after day. When the first hearing came, he put on his best shirt, the one he usually saved for job interviews or school events, and took Emily to a neighbor's house so she wouldn't have to sit through the stress of the courthouse. He felt strange walking up the courthouse steps, as though every person gathered outside could somehow sense what he was there for. There were more people than he expected. Protesters holding signs, some with slogans demanding justice, others with phrases so accusatory he couldn't bear to read them all. Cameras were everywhere, journalists moving in close to capture every angle. He kept his head down and walked past them, hearing snippets of shouting. "Coward!" one voice yelled. Another shouted something about bigots. His jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Inside the courtroom, the air was cooler, quieter, but no less tense. The prosecutor spoke of his use of disproportionate force. His attorney countered with a plea to remember the circumstances, to consider that he acted to protect someone. But no ruling would be given that day. The hearing was only to schedule further proceedings. When David left the courthouse, the crowd outside had doubled. They shouted as he walked past, and one man stepped into his path, forcing him to stop until a police officer moved the man aside. By the time he reached his truck, his hands were shaking. That night, Emily cried herself to sleep. She had overheard some kids at school talking about her dad, saying he was going to jail. David sat on the edge of her bed, stroking her hair until she calmed down, whispering reassurances he wasn't sure he believed himself. In the days that followed, the noise around the case only grew louder. News outlets ran story after story, some treating him like a monster, others like a hero. He had become a symbol, a headline, and it seemed no one was interested in the truth, only in using him to argue their own side. And then, quietly at first, something began to change. One evening, scrolling through his phone long after Emily had gone to bed, David noticed a post from a man he recognized from around town, a mechanic who owned a small shop on the edge of Main Street. The man wrote about a time he had intervened when he saw a woman being harassed in a parking lot, and how that woman later thanked him for saving her. "If we punish people for stepping in," the post read, "we're telling everyone to look the other way next time." The post went viral locally. Other men began to share their own stories, stopping fights, pulling strangers out of danger, calling for help when no one else would. Women joined in too, some writing that they would never have made it home safely if someone hadn't intervened. A wave of comments began to appear defending David, insisting that his actions should be seen for what they were, an instinct to protect. A few days later, a flyer appeared on his porch, not one of the ones condemning him, but one announcing a peaceful rally in front of the courthouse the day of his next hearing. The words were simple: "Stand for what's right." When that day arrived, David drove downtown with a sense of dread, expecting the same hostile crowd as before. But as he turned the corner near the courthouse, he saw something different. There were still protesters, still people with signs demanding punishment. But now there was another group too, standing across the street, holding their own signs. These were not angry slogans, but messages like, "Protect the protectors" and "Right to defend." There were fathers with their kids on their shoulders, elderly veterans in worn jackets, mothers holding babies, neighbors he recognized from the grocery store. The sight stopped him in his tracks. For weeks he had felt alone, like the entire world had turned against him. But here were people who believed in what he had done. Some nodded to him as he walked past, others clapped. He felt a lump rise in his throat and swallowed hard. Inside the courthouse, the hearing dragged on for hours. The prosecutor presented more evidence, including testimonies from two of the people involved in the confrontation. They claimed he had stormed into the bathroom unprovoked, that he was enraged. David clenched his fists under the table, but said nothing. When it was his turn, his attorney presented Claire's statement and requested to admit the security footage from the gas station cameras. The judge agreed to review it before the next session. After the hearing, David stepped outside to a wall of noise. Both groups were louder now, shouting back and forth across the street. He moved quickly toward his truck, but a reporter caught up with him, shoving a microphone in his face. "Do you regret what you did?" she asked. David paused, heart pounding. For a moment he considered saying something safe, something that might make the backlash quieter. But he remembered Claire's tear-streaked face that night at his kitchen table. The sound of her voice when she said they wouldn't let her leave. "No," he said finally, his voice steady. "I don't regret stopping it." The next morning, that clip was everywhere. Some people called him defiant, others called him brave. His attorney warned him that such statements could make negotiations for a plea deal harder. That night, David sat alone at the kitchen table long after Emily had gone to bed. He stared at the stack of papers his lawyer had given him, options for a plea bargain, ways to avoid jail time if he admitted guilt. The words blurred together as he thought about what that would mean. Admitting guilt would mean a lighter sentence, maybe probation. It would mean avoiding the risk of losing his job, his house, maybe even custody. But it would also mean saying, publicly, that he had done something wrong that night when every part of him knew he hadn't. He thought of Emily, of what kind of man he wanted her to see when she was old enough to remember this clearly. He thought of the girl he had saved and of the crowd outside who had chosen to stand up for him, even though they didn't have to. When his attorney called the next day, David's answer was ready. "No deal," he said. "We fight." The words surprised even him with how solid they felt. For the first time since that night at the gas station, he felt like he was standing on firm ground. The morning of the final hearing dawned gray and damp, as though the sky itself had been holding its breath. David woke before the alarm, staring at the ceiling while the weight of the day pressed down on his chest. This was it, the day that could decide not just his freedom, but everything he had left to protect. He moved quietly through the house, making coffee, getting dressed in the same shirt and jacket he had worn to every hearing before this one. Emily stirred in her room and padded sleepily into the kitchen, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Do you have to go again?" she asked softly. "Yes, baby," David said, kneeling to hug her. "But today might be the last time." He kissed her hair, breathing in the faint scent of shampoo, wishing he could shield her from the anxiety that hung over the house like a storm cloud. When the neighbor came to watch her, David stood on the porch for a moment before getting into the truck. The air was heavy, the world damp from a night of rain. As he drove, he saw the courthouse ahead, and with it, the crowd that had become almost familiar. Protesters lined the steps as before, but so did supporters, their presence stronger now, their signs clearer, their faces resolute. Someone waved at him as he passed, and for the first time, he allowed himself a small nod in return. Inside the courthouse, the air was electric, a hum of tension running through the hallways. The gallery was packed, reporters with notepads, local residents, people who had chosen to witness whatever history might be made that day. David's attorney guided him to their table, offering quiet reassurances, but his focus was already narrowing to the front of the room, to the bench where the judge would sit. When the proceedings began, the prosecutor delivered one final argument, speaking about the need to maintain order, the danger of letting individuals take matters into their own hands. David listened in silence, his hands folded tightly in front of him. Then came the defense's turn. His attorney rose and spoke steadily, methodically laying out the case. The security footage from the gas station showing Claire entering the restroom, then being followed by the group, the audio capturing her cries, the timing that matched David's arrival. When Claire was called to testify, the room fell into a hush. She took the stand, her hands trembling slightly as she raised them to swear the oath, but her voice was clear when she spoke. She told the court what had happened, how she had been blocked from leaving, how they had mocked her and recorded her distress, how David had appeared like some impossible rescue. "He didn't attack them," she said, her voice gaining strength. "He got me out of there. He stopped them. If he hadn't come in, I don't know what they would have done to me. I was terrified. He was the only one who helped." The footage was played next. Even though David had seen it before with his lawyer, his stomach still clenched watching the grainy video on the screen. The sound of Claire's voice crying out filled the courtroom. The moment he entered came next. The quick shove. The blow. But this time it was clear what had led up to it. There was no mistaking that he had walked into a situation already spiraling out of control. When the defense rested, the judge called for a short recess. David stepped into the hallway, leaning against the cool wall, his knees feeling unsteady. Reporters gathered at a distance, snapping pictures, shouting questions he ignored. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder. "This is the strongest case we could present," he said quietly. "Now it's up to the judge." The wait felt endless, but at last they were called back into the courtroom. David's heartbeat thudded in his ears as the judge entered, face unreadable. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as the decision was read. The court found that David's actions constituted a reasonable use of force in the defense of another person. He was cleared of all charges. The words seemed to echo through the room before they sank in. David felt his shoulders sag, a wave of relief washing over him so strongly that for a moment he thought he might collapse. Around him there was movement, supporters in the gallery clapping quietly, murmurs of approval. Outside the courthouse, when he finally stepped through the doors, the supportive crowd erupted into cheers. Cameras flashed, people shouted his name. But for once it didn't feel hostile. David didn't stay long. He thanked his lawyer, shook Claire's hand, and made his way back to his truck, moving quickly through the cluster of reporters. The only thing he wanted now was to go home. When he walked through the front door of the house, Emily was waiting. She ran to him, throwing her arms around his legs. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice small. "I'm okay," he said, crouching to hug her tightly. "It's over. We're going to be okay." That night, the house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not heavy, not oppressive, but calm. David sat on the porch after Emily had gone to bed, the night air cool against his face. He thought of everything that had happened, of the weeks of fear, of the strangers who had stood outside the courthouse to say that what he did mattered. He knew that some people would still call him a villain, that some headlines might never be corrected. But as he sat there, he realized that what mattered most wasn't convincing everyone. It was that he had acted according to his conscience. And in the end, the truth had been seen. A few days later, Claire reached out again. She had begun organizing a small advocacy group to support people who intervened to stop harm, offering legal aid and public support. "I don't want what happened to you to scare others away from helping," she wrote. David read the message twice, then looked over at Emily, who was drawing at the kitchen table. She looked up and smiled at him, a bright, unguarded smile that made something settle deep inside his chest. He smiled back, a quiet, steady smile. For the first time in months, he felt light, as though the air around him had cleared. The world outside might still argue about what was right and wrong, but here, in this house, he knew he had done what was right. And that was enough. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.